Once again, this is Darlito Bernard G. Delizo welcoming you to the subject personal identification, which is focused in fingerprint identification. For this video, we will be discussing the historical background of fingerprint identification. But of course, do not forget that we have our own identity with Christ. So remember that man and woman, the first man and woman, were created in the image of God. And if you are a, professing Christian, or if you say that you believe in the Bible, then you should believe that your identity is with the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so in the olden times, the oldest known fingerprint impression was taken from an earthenware estimated to be 6,000 years old, which was discovered at an archaeological site in northwest China and found to bear clearly discernible friction reeds impressions. And to date, it is considered as the oldest fingerprint impressions that are actually or that were actually recovered. And sometimes in 1955 to 1913 BC, King Hammurabi is known for the Hammurabi codes, use finger seals on contracts, and law officers of the day were authorized to secure fingerprints of arrested persons, as stated by Searchy 2011. And of course, in ancient Babylon, fingerprints were also found to be used on clay tablets for business transactions. And even in China, or in ancient China, thumbprints were found on clay seals also. And accordingly, some of the seals can be seen in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So between 1000 to 2000 BC, fingerprints were used on clay tablets for business transactions in ancient Babylon, as mentioned earlier. And in 3rd century BC, thumbprints begin to be used on clay seals in China to sign documents. And according to the records, Emperor Tian Shi, between 246 to 210 BC, was the first to use fingerprint in China. And to the Chinese, they called fingerprint as Hua Che or Che Hua because uh, they read actually their words in reverse direction. So instead of Huachi, they say Chi Hua. In Judea, as stated in 2 Thessalonians 3:17, the Apostle Paul concludes in one of his epistles or letters to the early Christians where he said that the salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is the token in every epistle, so I write. So some said that it could be that these words of Paul was referring to his finger impressions as a distinctive signature to indicate that he was the writer of such epistle. Of course, that is only an inference whether it was referring to the finger impressions of Paul, or it might be that he was referring to his signature. So we do not know. We can just make some inference on that. And in 1st century AD, a petroglyph located on a cliff face in Nova Scotia depicts a hand with exaggerated ridges and finger whorls, presumably left by the Mi'kmaq people. So again, those things were discovered by archaeologists and scientists that may show that the early people were already aware of the existence of impressions on the fingerprint. And again, in China, sometimes between 610 to 907 AD, during the Tang Dynasty, a time when Imperial China was one of the most powerful and wealthy regions of the world, and fingerprints were reportedly used on official documents. And again, in AD 1100, Chinese novelist Shi Naingan wrote in the story of the river bank, in which he stated that he compelled them meaning his subject in the story, he compelled them to ink their fingers to record their fingerprints. So even novelists during those early times were already contemplating or having that idea that fingerprints are, we call it, important in man's existence. In Japan also, deeds, notes, and certificates to be used as proofs were sealed by the mark of the hand, which was called palm print. And of course, the palm print was called the tigata by the Japanese. In the treatment of criminals, the imprint of the thumb, or they call it the buin or the buan, was also taken. In 14th century, in Persia, various government papers were reportedly impressed with fingerprints, and a government official who was also a physician made the observation that no fingerprints of two persons were exactly alike. So as early as 14th century, a physician, an unknown physician in Persia, have already made such observation that no two fingerprints of two persons were exactly alike, meaning the principle of individuality. Now, in 1684, Nehemiah Grew published a report which was read before the Royal Society of London, England, in which he described the ridges and pores of the hands and the feet. Okay, because he was an anatomist, a biologist, he described to them that there are ridges and pores on the hands and the feet. And 1685, Gobard Bidlow published a treaty describing sweet pores and ridges. And in 1685, he published an anatomical atlas Anatomia Humani Corporis, or the anatomy of the human body, in which he described papillary ridges on the skin. And in 1686, at the University of Bologna in Italy, a professor of anatomy named Marcello Malpighi notes the common characteristics of spirals, loops, and ridges in fingerprints using the newly invented microscope for his studies. So again, as early as those centuries, there were already anatomists and scientists who were interested or who have taken notes of the distinctive ridges formed on top of the bulb of the finger. And then Marcelo Malpighi became, of course, the grandfather of fingerprint because he discovered and researched the existence of ridges, spirals, and loops in fingerprints, and he found out that, that there are two layers or friction of the skin known as dermis, the stratum mucosum, and epidermis, the stratum corneum, or today it's called as the Malpighi layer, which is approximately 1.8 mm in thickness. And in 1751, Christian J. Henze wrote on the ridge formation but dealt with the subject from the viewpoint of anatomy rather than identification. And on the other hand, Bernard S. Albinos in 1764 followed along the same lines as Henze had written, that somehow they wrote about the ridges on top of the bulb of the finger, but not on the viewpoint of identification, but rather they tried to explain this insofar as anatomy is concerned. And in 1747 to 1821, Johannes Christopher and Andreas Mayer, also known as JCA Mayer, was a German anatomist, recognized that fingerprints are unique to each individual. He studied on the pattern and friction ridge skin and concluded that skin ridges is never duplicated in two persons. So he was one of the earliest people who formally wrote about the principle of individuality of fingerprints. And in 1823, Johannes Evangels Porkegi, an anatomy professor at the University of Breslau, described and published his thesis discussing the nine fingerprint patterns, the ridges, and giving them names. They named them as the plain arch, tented arch, loops, oblique loop, whorl, spiral, ellipse or elliptical whorl, circle or circular whorl, and double whorl or a composite. So with that, he was considered, or he is now considered, as the father of fingerprint. And in 1856, Hermann Welker established now the principle of permanency by printing his own hands. And after 43 years, he printed again and he pointed to them that his palm prints, okay, the ridges and patterns did not change. And again, William Herschel, as chief magistrate of the Hooghly district in Jongjipur, India, first used fingerprints on native contracts on a whim and without thoughts toward personal identification. He had Rajar Onay, a local businessman, impress his handprint on a contract. And he first used fingerprints to sign contracts with native Indians. So he was the first to use fingerprints to sign contracts with the native Indians in the early times of the United States of America. And Herschel further recorded uh, fingerprints recorded over a period of 57 years, meaning for 57 years he kept on recording fingerprints. As his fingerprint collection grew, however, Herschel began to note that the ink impressions could indeed prove or disprove identity. So earlier on, he was not thinking about personal identification, but as years passed by, he came to realized that fingerprint indeed could now be used to prove or disprove the identity of a person. While his experience with fingerprinting was admittedly limited, Herschel's private conviction that all fingerprints were unique to the individual as well as permanent throughout that individual's life inspired him to expand their use. Okay? Then in 1869, in England, legislated the Habitual Criminals Act, which provides longer sentences for hardened criminals with previous convictions. Of course, the idea on this thing is that somehow they need to identify who are these habitual criminals. And later on, of course, when fingerprint identification was introduced, at least they could now identify the habitual criminals based on their fingerprints. And in 1880, Dr. Henry Folds, he was considered, or he's considered as the first person to have used a Latin print for identification purposes. And in his works, he discussed fingerprints as a means of personal identification and the use of printer's ink as a method for obtaining such fingerprints. And his studies include what he called skin furrows during the 1870s after looking at fingerprints on pieces of old clay pottery. He is also credited with the first fingerprint identification, a greasy print left by a laboratory worker on a bottle of alcohol. And in 1882, in the US, Gilbert Thompson, who was a geological survey in New Mexico, used his own thumbprint on a document to prevent forgery. This is the first known use of fingerprints in the United States. Well, in the history of the American government or the American people, there were numerous cases of forgeries in the early United States of America. And in fact, the U.S. Secret Service was then employed as the primary agency to detect forgery and falsification, because those were the times in which the lands of America were being surveyed and given to those who should own those lands. And of course, to avoid or to prevent forgery, it was Gilbert Thompson who thought of putting his, we call it fingerprint or thumbprint to avoid forgery. And then Isaiah Westeber, a photographer in San Francisco, was already engaged in the study and promotion of the fingerprint system long before Galton's participation. He advocated the use of the system for the registration of the immigrant Chinese. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that the he was focusing on or zeroing on the Chinese? Well, because if you're going to look at the faces of the Chinese, if you are not familiar with their looks, you might be confused as to or in distinguishing one from another. Just like if you're an American and you are looking at Filipinos, then you might as well assume that Filipinos, most Filipinos look alike, no? So somehow to easily identify this Chinese immigrant, Isaiah Westeber advocated now that somehow they should, we call it, be fingerprinted so that they can be properly identified. And that is during the, we call it, registration of immigrant Chinese. And in 1883, Arthur Coleman, an anthropologist who wrote his book on ridges and pores, He did not associate fingerprints with identification. However, he was the first to identify the locations of the volar pads on the hands and feet. So the volar pads, that's the place or the location inside the hand or on the palm side of the hands and the sole side of the feet. Okay, in which we call it ridges and poros can be located, and those volar pads, those are the portion of the sole and the palm that adheres or touches a flat surface. And in 1883, Mark Twain, known as Samuel Clemens in real life, was known as Mark Twain in his books. He tried now to emphasize the importance of a fingerprint in his, we call it in his book, Life on the Mississippi, in which in his book he mentioned about a murderer was identified by the use of fingerprint identification. And in 1888, Sir Francis Galton began his study of fingerprints, and during the 1980s, he primarily to develop a tool for determining genetic history and hereditary traits, meaning he was involved in eugenics. So when you say eugenics, those are the people who are trying now to conduct a study on what makes a good gene. So eugenics means good genes. So in Francis Galton's we call it work, he was thinking that certain people with good intelligence and good health, they possess a particular fingerprint impression. And then he became the first to provide scientific evidence that no two fingerprints are exactly the same and that prints remain the same throughout a person's lifetime. Okay? So he was relating fingerprint actually earlier on as a means of determining good genes and good intelligence of people until he finally came up with the scientific evidence that indeed fingerprints are distinct from one another and permanent in one person. And in 1891, Juan Bustis, an Argentine police official, began the first fingerprint files based on Galton pattern types. At first, Bustis included the Bertillon system with the files, and eventually, okay, his system was used by most of the Latin American countries. That's why he was called the father of fingerprints in all Spanish-speaking countries. Juan Bustis. And Galton, further in his studies, he detailed now the first classification system for fingerprints. He started identifying the three types: the loop, the whorl, and the arch. Okay, also known as and then later on the characteristics of the fingerprints, meaning the minutia or the reeds characteristics. And those reeds characteristics, okay, are to an extent still in use today and often referred to as Galton's details, just like the bifurcation, the dots, the short reeds, the enclosures. Those are actually the scientific findings of Galton. And in 1892, in this particular case, there were, we call it diverging, or there are diverse ideas as to who has, we call it, identified the killer of the children of Francisca Rojas. Some other books credit it to Juan Justiz, but most books credit it to Police Inspector Alvarez. Okay, where Police Inspector Alvarez accordingly used the system of justice. But again, as I've said, some say that it was justice actually, but most books pertain to Police Alvarez, who was the actual investigator, and with the help of justice, they were able to identify the killer, uh, who was actually the parent or the mother of the two victims. And in 1894, in Britain, they started to adopt an identification system, which is a combination of anthropometry by Bertillon and fingerprints. Okay, so that was a time where when the case of the West brothers was not yet we call it noted in the history, no, because during those times. The Great Britain still believe on the system of Alphonse Bertillon. So in their identification system, they included all the details of anthropometry by Bertillon and including the fingerprints. Now, in 1896, the reliability of fingerprint was tested when Adolf Beck was jailed for several years after he was falsely identified by witnesses as the perpetrator of a crime. But later, fingerprint have shown he was a wrong man. Okay, so it might be that Adolf Beck could be the first person exonerated by reason of fingerprint identification. And in 1896, the International Association of Chiefs of Police established the National Bureau of Criminal Identification for the exchange of arrest information. And in 1897, the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation based in Chicago, Illinois, was established. It is considered the depot of all criminal records which has been classified and filed using anthropological measurement. So it's a depot back in America. That was the original depot of the criminal records. But of course, during those times, they were not still using fingerprint, but rather they were using the anthropological measurement of Bertillon. Until, of course, uh, the uh, the flop on the case of the West brothers. And in 1998, the Canadian Police Service adopted criminal identification using a system introduced by Bertillon. So eventually, that system introduced by Alphonse Bertillon reached the land of Canada. Again, that was still the time when the West Brothers, okay, was not yet encountered by police investigators or by personal identification, by people who are involved in personal identification. And in 1900, the Belfer Committee in England was established to look into the working of the method of identification of criminals by measurement and fingerprints. And of course, Edward Richard Henry was one of the experts who gave evidence in support of using fingerprints as a means of identification. And in December 1900, the Bilper Committee recommended that the current method of Bertillonades be replaced by Henry system because they found out that the system introduced by Richard Henry was simpler and was more accurate than the Bertillon system. So with that, the Belper Committee recommended that instead of using the Bertillonades, they would rather use the system introduced by Edward Richard Henry. Actually, the Henry system is used by most countries, or if not all countries in the world, with some modifications. And in 1901, Edward Henry was appointed as head of Scotland Yard's new fingerprint branch on July 1901. And the previous requirement to take prints only of habitual criminals widened to include all prisoners whose sentence was more than 1 month. And earlier in 1896, he developed a system which included 1,024 primary classification. Anyway, we will be discussing the primary classifications in further video under the subject fingerprint identification. Now, in 1901, further, Sir Edward Henry, the Inspector General of Police in Bengal, India, so he was transferred to Bengal, India, developed now the first system of classifying fingerprints. So it was in India where he formally developed the first system of classifying. Okay, we call it developing from primary classification to uh, final classification. So the Henry classification, as I mentioned a while back, is still in use today in English-speaking countries around the globe, and that is to include the Philippines. And in 1902, the first conviction in the United Kingdom of an individual was made as a result of fingerprints found at the scene of the crime in June 1902, in which a burglar by the name of Harry Jackson left his thumbprint on the paintwork of the house he entered in South London. And despite the enormous task of comparing thousands of prints, Detective Sergeant Charles Stockley Collins and his colleagues at the branch identified it with Jackson's record card, meaning, okay, with even with the enormous numbers, thousands of fingerprints to be compared, they were able to identify those fingerprint that was left by Jackson. And in 1902 to 1903, Sir Henry Forrest, the chief medical examiner of New York Civil Service Commission and an American preacher in fingerprint science in the U.S. for the New York Civil Service Commission, he advocated the use of, we call it fingerprint identification to prevent applicants from having better qualified persons to take the test for them. Okay, so if only signature uh, will be used in the filing of the examination, well, that could be easily forged. So somehow, Henry Forrest took notes that the fingerprint must be added. That's why, if you will be taking the board exam in the Philippines, more often than not, in your examination or in your admission slip, you have there your photograph and your thumbprint. Okay, because even in the Philippines, there were cases that a better qualified person took an examination or a civil service exam for another person. There was a case somewhere in the Visayas or Cebu, I suppose, where an inmate was arrested for taking the civil service exam multiple times using different names. And it turned out that he was being paid by some jail officers to take the exam for them. Okay, so again, the Philippines encountered the same problem in America, where better qualified people um, take the exam for other people. That's why Henry Forrest said it is but right that fingerprint be used part of the admission slip or admission permit or exam permit of the examinees. So in 1902, again, because of the case of Will West in America, somehow fingerprinting as a means of identification had been vindicated in the English courts, meaning fingerprint was given due preference over other means of identification. And again, in America, in 1903, fingerprinting was implemented by the New York State Prison System and at Leavenworth Penitentiary, also at Sing Sing, Napanoth, Auburn, and Clinton prisons. Okay, so those years now began the massive use of fingerprinting or recording fingerprints. But of course, most were focused on criminals because if ever they will escape or they will be released from prison, and if ever they will be again committing another crime, at least they have already a record in those prisons that can be used later on to identify them. In 1905, Henry Folds sided with the Stratton brothers when the two were charged with murder of Thomas and Anne Farrow. Okay, the Stratton brothers, however, were eventually convicted and hanged through the use of fingerprint, or they were convicted, okay, by hanging, okay, and identified through the use of fingerprint as evidence. And in 1918, Lockhart wrote that if 12 points, Galton's details, were the same between two fingerprints, it would suffice as a positive identification. So, Edmund Lockhart said that we need at least 12. Of course, other countries, they differ. They have 10, 16, like that. But for Lockhart, he said that to establish positive identification, then there must be at least 12 points of Galton's details, meaning the uh, the location of the bifurcation, the short reads, the ending reads, the dot, the enclosures, the cross reads, all those things. He was saying that there should be identical uh, Galton details or reads characteristics between the unknown and the known to establish positive identification. Okay, but of course, as we move on, today countries already accepted that the number of identical reads characteristic is not anymore necessary because there are other ways and means in which a fingerprint may provide positive identification. Now, in 1903, fingerprinting technology come into widespread use, or fingerprinting technology came into widespread use in the United States, as the New York Police Department, the New York State Prison System, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons begin working with the new science. And in 1904, in St. Louis Police Department and the Leavenworth State Penitentiary in Kansas, they started utilizing fingerprinting assisted by a sergeant from Scotland Yard who had been guarding the British display at the St. Louis Exposition. Okay, so this sergeant from Scotland Yard could be assumed that was once a student of Edward Henry about fingerprint classification. So while he was detailed in the St. Louis Exposition, he was tapped to help the St. Louis Police in coming up with the fingerprint identification system. And in 1911, the first central storage location for fingerprints in North America is established in Ottawa by Edward Foster of the Dominion Police Force. And the repository is maintained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And while it originally held only 200 sets of fingerprints, today the number is over 2 million, or more than that, perhaps 5 million. Okay? So somehow, uh, Canada also started recognizing that fingerprint must be used rather than the Bertillonage or the Bertillon system. And in 1917, the first palm print identification is made in Nevada, where a bloody palm print found on a letter left at the scene of a stagecoach robbery. So when you say stagecoach robbery, it's actually a train, and a murder of its driver was identified to Ben Call. Okay, but of course, the stagecoach, the coach, if you are going to join coaches, then you have train. Okay, so perhaps this is a single coach. So uh, it was identified to Ben Call. Okay, so the first palm print murder conviction in the U.S. is uh, based on this Ben Call case. Now, in 1924, the U.S. Congress act to establish the U.S. Congress acted to establish the Identification Division of the FBI, which was headed by uh, Edgar Hoover, and the National Bureau and Leavenworth are consolidated to form now to form the basis of the FBI Fingerprint Repository. Okay, so those with the National Bureau of Criminal Identification and at Leavenworth, they were all integrated now to form what you call the Fingerprint Repository of the FBI. So to come up with a centralized we call it recording of fingerprint. In the Philippines, we have the NBI as our centralized recording of fingerprint. Of course, we have also the Philippine National Police. In 1946, the FBI had processed 100 million fingerprint, and it grew to more or less 200 million by 1971. And in the Philippines, Agripino Ruiz, a constabulary agent and fingerprint expert, successfully defended his finding in 10 points of comparison based on the decision of Supreme Court in the case of Marciano Medina, okay, dated December 23, 1933. And it is considered as the first leading judicial decision on the Philippine jurisprudence on the science of fingerprint. But of course, in America, the People versus Jennings is considered as the first, we call it the admission of fingerprint as an evidence in the court. Now, in 1940, by the end of World War II, or 1940s, by the end of World War II, most American fingerprint experts agreed that there was no scientific basis for a minimum number of corresponding minutiae to determine an identification. Again, when you say identification, that is positive identification. And the 12 points rule was dropped from the FBI publication, The Science of Fingerprints. So, the went away from Locard's 12 points or 10 points or 16 points. So FBI finally decided that we are not going to use that minimum number. Okay, it could be less than 12, it could be 10, it could be 8, or less than that, it could be 6. okay, or it could be none because fingerprint identification can be used also by comparing the pores and the ridges. In 1946, the FBI had processed 100 million fingerprint. Again, we mentioned that earlier on. And then in 1973, the International Association for Identification Standards, or the IAIS, committee authored a resolution, again stating that each identification is unique and no valid basis exists to require a minimum number of matching points into friction reads impressions to establish a positive identification. Because earlier on, countries have set 10, 12, 16, okay, points of comparison. But in 1973, the International Association for Identification Standardization, meaning this is now a conglomeration of countries. So they agreed that we should not set a minimum number of identical characteristics, but rather, okay, there are other ways and means to establish positive identification. In 1974, four employees of the Hertfordshire in UK Fingerprint Bureau contacted fingerprint experts throughout UK to organize the country's first professional fingerprint organization. In the Philippines, we have the FISPIL, or the Fingerprint Identification Society Philippines. Okay, so that was that is an organization started by criminologists in the country. Well, it was only recently. Okay, so with that, the UK came up with the National Society of Fingerprint Officers, and it quickly expanded to international scope and was renamed the Fingerprint Society. So that is now an international society beginning 1977. And in 2017, the Fingerprint Society merged with the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences, okay, and has been known as the CSFS Fingerprint Division. In 1980s, the introduction of AFIS, computerization of fingerprint identification, better known as the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. And what about the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or the IAFIS? Well, in America, every state, they have their own AFIS. And their AFIS is connected with the other states. So they call now as the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. Now, in the Philippines, if say in Cordillera or in different regions, they have their office, and if they will be interconnected later on, then it will become an integrated automated fingerprint identification system in the Philippines. Okay, so this system of storing and cross-referencing criminal fingerprint records is capable of searching millions of fingerprint files in minutes, revolutionizing law enforcement efforts. Meaning, the tedious and very slow process of identification by means of fingerprint became much, we call it, expeditious than the usual, because in a matter of seconds or minutes, okay, the system can cross examine or can cross reference files on record. That is, if the person being identified has already a record in the system. But otherwise, uh, his records, or otherwise he could not be identified by the office system also. So the office relies on the data that are already stored in the system. In June 1995, the International Symposium on Latent Fingerprint Detection and Identification, conducted by the Israeli National Police Agency at Nurem, Israel, in June 1995, okay, they issued now a declaration called the Nurem Declaration, authored by Pierre Margot and a fingerprint expert from the U.S. Army Crime Lab, in which they state that no scientific basis exists for requiring that a predetermined minimum number of friction reads features must be present into impression in order to establish a positive identification. Okay, so that is now what you call adapting the the principle laid out by the FBI earlier on, that they should not be banking on the minimum number of 10 or 12 or 16 identical reads characteristics just to establish a positive identification. So the international community began saying that the court should agree that there is no uh, limit, or there is no minimum requirement for establishing positive identification, or to establish positive identification. And in 1996, as Americans became more concerned with the growing missing and abducted children problem in law enforcement groups, they urge now the fingerprinting of children for investigative purposes in the event of a child becoming missing. And Chris Migliaro founded the Fingerprint America in Albany, New York. Okay, so children are also fingerprinted so that if ever a child is stolen, then at least when he grew up, he could be identified as the same person. In 2012, the International Police Organization, the Interpol, automated fingerprint identification system repository exceeds 150,000 sets of fingerprints for important international criminal records from 190 member countries. But of course, today is 2021, so there may be a double number or triple or more than that. And over 170 countries have 24 by 7 or 24/7 interface ability with Interpol expert fingerprint service, meaning there is now a connection among countries of their office system. So they could now easily get in touch with other people in other countries just to establish identity of fugitives running from one country to another countries. In 2018, America's largest databases, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Biometric Identity Management. Now, uh, the biometrics of the fingerprint became more comprehensive with the addition of other physical features that are recorded in the system. So we have now the biometric system containing over 120 million persons' fingerprints, many in the form of two-finger records. And the U.S. visit program has been migrating from two flat, not rolled fingerprints to 10 flat since 2007. So they are now trying to migrate the records from two flat to recording the 10 flat or the plain impression since 2007. And the fast capture technology currently enables recording of 10 simultaneous fingerprint impressions in as little as 15 seconds. Okay, so simultaneously, that fast capture technology now can record the plain impressions of the 10 fingers of a person. If you are going to do it manually, it may take you some minutes before you can record the plain and the ruled impressions of a person. Say you are going to take 30 seconds per or 1 minute per finger, so it will take you at least 10 minutes to record the 10 fingerprints of a person. If you add also the other activities such as cleaning of the fingerprint pad or the equipment, then it may take you 10 to 15 minutes in average of recording the patterns of a person. Now, in the fast capture, it may take as little as 15 seconds per person. So as of July 2018, the FBI's next generation identification. Okay, so they came up with the NGI, the next generation identification, conducts more than 300,000 10-print record searches per day against more than 140 million computerized fingerprint records, both criminal and civil applicant. NGI is the FBI's most valuable service to American law enforcement, providing accurate and rapid fingerprint identification support. Okay, so imagine that it can cross-search 300,000 10-print record per day just to search files of people in their fingerprint database. That's why in America, if a criminal has already a record in the system, he can easily be caught by the police or identified by the police if the data contains already the record of that person. Otherwise, the data cannot help in doing so. And now we have what you call the international sharing. Many European nations currently leverage multiple fingerprint information sharing operations, including the following: the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System, the European Dactyloscopy or the Eurodac, and the Europol. Okay? And additionally, a biometric-based entry-exit system is in planning stages. And perhaps 2021, they have already implemented that. And of course, other countries followed the uh, uh, the system or the system applied by European countries, the international sharing. So there is now international sharing of fingerprint files among countries. So many other countries exchanges searches and fingerprint records in a similar manner as Europe, and with automated and non-automated interfaces existing in accordance with the national international privacy laws and the urgency importance of such searches. Okay, so somehow the if you are a criminal running or fugitive coming from other countries, okay, you can now be easily be traced by law enforcers. So in 2018, the world's largest database is not America, but rather the Unique Identification Authority of India, the world's largest fingerprint and largest multimodal biometric system, okay, using fingerprint, face record, and iris biometric records, also known as the Aadhaar, the word meaning the foundation. In several Indian languages, Aadhaar is a voluntary program with the goal of providing reliable identification documents to most of estimated India's 1.25 billion residents. Okay? So again, just like the Philippines, India is also a multi-language or multi-dialect country. So their system is we call it translated in different Indian languages. Okay? If in the Philippines, it should be translated to Cebuano, okay, to Tagalog, to Pangasinense, or Kapampangan, or kind like that. No, so um, the Unique Identification Authority of India is considered the world's largest fingerprint, and it has a feature of the fingerprint, face, and biometric. And again, uh, we call it. They have translations of the findings or the data. And in the Philippines, what about in the Philippines? Of course, as we have mentioned earlier, as early as 1933, fingerprint was already used in the Philippines. But insofar as office is concerned, the office in the country was donated by the JICA or the Japan International Coordinating Agency. Okay, the way back in 1998, okay, amounting to 419 million pesos. And in August 2004, office started operation and was eventually turned over to the PNP in May 2005. So we have office in, we call it in the PNP. So hoping that regions will have their own office also. Okay. So with that, fingerprint underwent 100 years or even 1,000 years before finally it became an admissible evidence in the court. So with that, thank you very much for watching and listening. And if you have not subscribed yet my channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you and God bless us all.